He hadn't so much as brushed shoulders with another person in 12 years. 12 years of dust, wind, and the kind of silence that rings in your ears. James Coulter was a ghost, and he liked it that way. Up in the Arizona hills, memories were the only company he kept, and his were sharp enough to cut. He had a cabin built with his own two hands, a shotgun that never left his side, and a hole in his soul shaped like a girl from Tennessee he couldn't save. Life had taken its pound of flesh, and he'd given up asking for change. Then one blistering afternoon, the world tore a new door in his life. She stumbled out of the tree line, a phantom made of dirt and desperation. She was barefoot, her skin caked in grime, and wrapped in a piece of faded white cloth that might have once been a dress, or maybe a burial shroud. Her arms were a road map of scrapes and thorns. Her lips were cracked like dry riverbeds. But her eyes were the real horror story. They were wide, vacant, like she'd stared into the sun and seen God turn away. She took 3 shaky steps onto his property, then her legs gave out. She collapsed in a heap, not with a scream, not with a cry for help, but with a shudder that seemed to shake the very ground. As he approached, she clutched that filthy white cloth to her chest, her knuckles bone white. 2 words escaped her lips, barely a whisper on the wind. "Please don't." James froze. His heart, a thing he thought had turned to stone years ago, gave a hard, painful kick against his ribs. There wasn't much blood on the outside, but inside she was clearly hemorrhaging fear. Every muscle in her body trembled, a high-frequency vibration of pure terror. He took a single, slow step forward. She flinched, a movement as sharp and involuntary as a deer catching the scent of a wolf. But she didn't pull away. That's when the cloth slipped. Just an inch. But it was enough. What he saw on the skin of her back made his stomach clench into a fist of ice. It wasn't just a wound. It was a declaration of ownership. Burns fresh and old. Welts laid over welts, like layers of paint on a rotten wall. Deep, twisted scars that formed unnatural shapes. They weren't random. They were symbols, letters, a cruel, deliberate script carved into her flesh. James stumbled back, a gasp catching in his throat. It wasn't the violence of it that struck him. He'd seen violence. He'd dealt it. It was the artistry, the cold, calculated cruelty, and the way she instinctively tried to cover it, curling into herself like a child trying to disappear from a monster under the bed. For a split second, he wasn't in Arizona anymore. He was back in the humid backwoods of Tennessee. The air was thick with the smell of pine and gunpowder. And he was looking at Lily, his little sister, her eyes holding that same shattered reflection of the world. The girl he'd failed, the promise he'd broken, the memory that had driven him into this self-imposed exile. He had walked away once. He had lived with the ghost of that choice every single day for 12 years. He swore he would never, ever walk away again. Without a word, moving with the slow, deliberate calm of a man disarming a bomb, he took off his heavy canvas coat. He knelt down and wrapped it around her frail, trembling shoulders. It was a promise made of fabric and warmth. No questions, no platitudes, just action. He slid his arms beneath her, one under her knees, one behind her back, and lifted. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of sticks and shattered hope. He carried her toward the cabin, away from the hell that had spit her out. And as he crossed the threshold of the home he'd built to keep the world out, he knew one thing with terrifying certainty. He had just let the world and all its devils right back in. The cabin was supposed to be his fortress, his tomb. Now it was a field hospital. He laid her down on the old cot in the corner, the one he never used. She didn't fight him, didn't even seem to register the change in surroundings. She just curled into a tight ball, clutching the lapels of his coat like it was the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. Her eyes, those terrible, empty eyes, scanned every corner of the room, every shadow, expecting an attack from any direction. James didn't press her. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself. It was the look of someone who understood that the only difference between a savior and a captor was timing. So he did what he always did when words felt like landmines. He moved. He built a small fire in the wood stove. Not for warmth, the day was still hot, but for the sound. The gentle crackle and pop was a heartbeat for the silent room, a rhythm to push back against the oppressive quiet. He filled a kettle with water from the pump, his movements measured and loud, telegraphing his every action so there were no surprises. Every time a floorboard creaked, she flinched. When the wind rattled the shutters, her whole body went rigid. He made coffee. The grounds were stale, the taste was bitter, but the ritual was grounding. It gave his hands a purpose. He sat at the small, scarred wooden table across the room, his shotgun resting against the wall beside him, close enough to be a comfort. He didn't stare at her. He watched the fire. He watched the steam rise from his cup, and he listened to the sound of her breathing, shallow, ragged, but steady. She was broken, but she wasn't dead, and that, he knew, was a dangerous thing to be. Hours bled into one another. The harsh afternoon light softened into the golden glow of evening, then faded to the deep, star-dusted blue of a desert night. She hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. It was a standoff between her pain and his patience. Then, just as he was about to add another log to the fire, she stirred. Her head turned on the lumpy pillow, just a fraction of an inch. Her eyes, no longer scanning for threats, found his. They locked for a single, breathless moment. There was no fear in them now, no hope either, just a flicker of raw, exhausted humanity, a silent acknowledgement. I see you. You are there. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The kind of nod soldiers share in a trench when the shelling stops. A silent pact that says, "We're still here." She turned her head back to the wall. The connection was broken, but something had passed between them. A spark had jumped the chasm of their shared silence. The next morning the sun streamed through the dusty window pane, and with it came her first word. Water! Her voice was a dry rasp, like sandpaper on old wood. He was on his feet in an instant, filling a tin cup from the bucket. He approached the cot slowly, holding the cup out. No sudden moves. She pushed herself up, wincing as the movement pulled at the wounds on her back. She took the cup with a hand that shook so badly, water sloshed over the rim. She drank, her throat working convulsively. When the cup was empty, she didn't hand it back right away. She just held it, staring at him. The look wasn't one of gratitude. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a statement. I'm still here. James nodded again, taking the cup. He knew this was just the beginning. That one word, that one sip of water, was the first stone in an avalanche. He just had no idea how big the mountain was, or how many bodies were buried underneath it. He thought he was offering a cup of water. He had no idea he was accepting a declaration of war. She didn't talk much for the rest of that day. It was like her first word had cost her all the energy she had. She answered his few, gentle questions with a nod or a shake of her head. Yes, she could eat. No, she didn't know where she was. Yes, the broth was hot. It was a slow, painstaking dance of trust. He'd leave a bowl of stew on the table and retreat to the porch, giving her the space to eat without feeling watched. Late that afternoon, he was on the porch, whittling a piece of scrap wood into nothing in particular, just letting the rhythmic scrape of the knife calm his nerves. The front door creaked open. He didn't look up, didn't want to spook her. She stepped out into the sunlight, squinting, his heavy coat still draped over her shoulders like armor. She sat on the top step a few feet away from him, pulling her knees to her chest. For a long time they just sat there, listening to the wind in the pines. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. Then so quietly he almost missed it. She spoke to the trees. They made me clean their boots, with my own shirt. James kept carving. He didn't flinch, didn't react. He just shaved a long, thin curl from the wood. A silent signal. I'm listening. Encouraged, she continued, her voice still a monotone, scrubbed clean of all emotion. It was a camp, for mining, not on any map. Her words came in short, brutal bursts, like she was pulling shards of glass from her memory. They work you till you break. Then they punish you for breaking. She paused, taking a shaky breath. I ran. Twice. James stopped whittling. He looked at her now. Her profile was stark against the setting sun. First time, she whispered, her hand instinctively going to her face. They broke my nose. Told me I'd never smell freedom again. She took another breath, this one even shakier. The second time, the second time, they made the marks. She didn't need to say what marks. He could feel them burning in his mind. He didn't ask her how she got out the third time. Some stories are too heavy to tell when the sun is setting. He figured that one was written in blood, and he didn't need to read it just yet. But just as the last sliver of sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, a new sound cut through the evening calm. It was faint at first, then grew steadily louder, a sound that didn't belong in his quiet world. Hoofbeats. One horse, riding fast, coming right up the ridge road. James was on his feet in a second, his whittling knife forgotten on the porch floor. He grabbed the shotgun from its place by the door. With a sharp jerk of his head, he motioned her inside. "Get in! Stay down!" The terror was back in her eyes in an instant. The fragile peace of the afternoon shattered. But she didn't freeze. She scrambled inside like a phantom, her movements practiced, honed by experience. She knew this drill. James stepped off the porch, the shotgun held loose but ready at his side. He stood in the middle of the path to his cabin, a weathered, unmovable object. The rider crested the ridge and pulled his horse to a halt, kicking up a cloud of red dust. He didn't look like a cowboy. He wore a fancy vest over a sweat-stained shirt and a greasy mustache that failed to hide the cruel sneer on his lips. He looked like a man who enjoyed his power a little too much. His eyes scanned the cabin, then landed on James, dismissing him in an instant. He raised his voice, a slimy, confident drawl. "Ellie Rose, I know you're in there. You got one chance to come on back quiet. Don't make this unpleasant." So she had a name. Ellie Rose. James took a step forward, the gravel crunching under his boots. "She's not going anywhere." The man Silas smirked, a real punchable smirk. "That ain't your decision to make, old-timer. That girl is property of the Black Creek Mining Company." James didn't raise the shotgun. He didn't need to. He just cocked it. The double click-clack of the hammers was louder than a cannon shot in the quiet air. It was a sound that spoke a universal language. It said, "This is my land, and you've just trespassed." Silas's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. His hand, which had been drifting casually toward the pistol on his hip, froze. He looked from James's cold, dead eyes to the twin barrels of the shotgun, and then back. He was a bully, not a fool. He knew a man who had nothing left to lose when he saw one. He spat a glob of tobacco juice into the dirt, narrowly missing James's boot. He wheeled his horse around, the animal skittish and nervous. "This ain't over," he snarled over his shoulder. But as he rode away, the look he gave the cabin wasn't just angry, it was calculating. It was a promise of fire and ruin. And James knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the man wasn't just coming back. He was coming back with an army. For a long time after the sound of hoofbeats faded, James just stood there, the heavy shotgun feeling like a part of his own arm. The sun was gone, and the cold of the desert night began to creep in, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Ellie appeared in the doorway behind him, a silhouette of fear. "He knows my name," she whispered, as if that was the most terrifying part. "He knows you're here," James corrected grimly. "That's worse." He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his chair by the window, the shotgun across his lap, watching the moonlit landscape. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching footsteps. He was back in the war, on watch, the enemy hidden in the darkness. Only this time, the person he had to protect was just a few feet away, sleeping a fitful, nightmare-ridden sleep. Sometime before dawn, he made a decision. He couldn't do this alone. There was only one person in the world he trusted, a man whose ghost walked beside his own, a man who owed him. He tore a scrap of paper from an old ledger and scribbled a short, cryptic message. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a summons. He addressed it to Sheriff Abram Hale in the town of Redemption, a 2-day ride from his homestead. He didn't mention Ellie or the camp or Silas. He just wrote 3 words, "The chickadee sings." It was a code from their time in the war. It meant the enemy was inside the wire. It meant all hell was about to break loose. He gave the note to a traveling peddler he knew, a man who passed through every few weeks, along with a silver dollar for his trouble and a warning to ride fast. As the peddler disappeared down the ridge, James felt a small sliver of relief. Help was on the way. But then he looked at the horizon, and the relief curdled into dread. A 2-day ride was an eternity, and he had a feeling they didn't have 2 days. 3 days passed. 3 days of suffocating quiet. It wasn't the peaceful solitude he was used to. It was the held-breath silence of a hunted animal waiting for the snap of a twig. James didn't chop wood. He didn't check his traps. He patrolled the perimeter of his cabin like a caged wolf, cleaning and recleaning the shotgun until the metal gleamed. Ellie watched him, her fear a constant, palpable presence in the small cabin. She tried to help, sweeping the floor, tending the fire, her small movements a desperate attempt to create a sense of normalcy in a world that was anything but. They barely spoke, but a strange bond was forming between them, forged in shared dread. She was no longer just a victim he was protecting. She was his watchman, her ears tuned to the slightest unfamiliar sound, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line. On the third day, late in the afternoon, it happened. The air went completely still. The birds stopped singing. The insects went silent. It was the kind of unnatural hush that comes right before a storm breaks. And then he heard it. Hoofbeats, plural, coming up the ridge road, slow and deliberate. Not the hurried pace of a single rider, but the confident, unhurried tread of a group that knew they owned the ground they rode on. James grabbed the shotgun. Inside. Back room. Don't make a sound. Ellie vanished without a word. He stood in the doorway, blocking it with his body, his thumb resting on the hammers of the shotgun. 3 riders emerged from the trees. Silas was in the lead, his greasy mustache twisted into a triumphant sneer. The 2 men with him were cut from the same cloth, hard-faced, eyes like chips of flint, guns worn high and easy on their hips. They weren't ranch hands, they were hired muscle. The kind of men you pay to do things you don't want your name attached to. They reined in about 20 yards from the cabin, fanning out in a semicircle, a classic intimidation tactic. Silas leaned forward in his saddle. Last chance, old man. Step aside. We only want the girl. James's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. I told you, she's not going anywhere. One of Silas's men, a lanky man with a scar down his cheek, shifted in his saddle. His hand drifted down, slow and lazy, resting on the butt of his pistol. It was a test, a provocation. James didn't wait to see if it was a bluff. He fired. The roar of the shotgun shattered the silence, a deafening blast of fire and lead. He hadn't aimed to kill, just to send a message. The blast of rock salt and buckshot tore into the lanky man's leg. He screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain, and toppled from his horse like a sack of grain, clutching his bloody thigh. The other 2 men froze, their hands hovering over their guns. They hadn't expected this. They had expected an old man, easily cowed. They got a wolf, cornered and ready to fight to the death. Silas stared, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He was about to give an order, to start a war he couldn't lose, when another voice cut through the tense standoff, a voice like worn leather and old iron. I'd think real hard about your next move, son. Everyone turned. Stepping out from the dense cover of the pines, silent as a ghost, was another man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. A silver star was pinned to his chest. On it were the words, Sheriff, Redemption, Territory. In his hands he held a Winchester rifle, and he held it like he was born with it. Sheriff Abram Hale, James's old friend. He'd made it in a day and a half. Abram's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, swept over Silas and his remaining man. This here is my jurisdiction now. And the young lady inside that cabin, he said, his voice dropping to a low growl, is officially under my protection as a material witness to a federal crime. Silas's face went pale. Federal crime? What are you talking about? This is a simple labor dispute. Abram smiled, but it was a cold, predatory thing. Is that what you call kidnapping, forced labor, and illegal mining on federal land? because that's what my report is going to say." He gestured with the rifle towards the wounded man, who was now groaning on the ground. "Now, I suggest you pick up your trash and get off this property before I decide to add assaulting a citizen and resisting arrest to the list." The remaining henchman looked at Silas, his bravado gone, replaced by uncertainty. Silas looked at the shotgun in James's hands, then at the rifle in Abrams, and did the math. He was outgunned and outmaneuvered. He cursed under his breath, a vile, venomous string of words. He dismounted, helped his wounded man back onto his horse, and without another look at James or the sheriff, rode away. But the hatred in his eyes was a promise. This wasn't over. They had won the battle. The war had just been declared. As the dust settled, Abram lowered his rifle, the tension draining from his shoulders. He walked over to James, a weary but genuine smile touching his lips. "The chickadee sings, huh?" Abram said, his voice raspy. "You always were a man of few words, James." James finally uncocked the shotgun, the sound deafeningly loud in the sudden quiet. "You got here fast." "Your note smelled like gunpowder and regret," Abram replied, clapping a hand on his old friend's shoulder. "I figured it was serious." He glanced toward the cabin door, where Ellie was peeking out, her eyes wide. "Looks like you found yourself a whole new kind of war." James just nodded, his gaze fixed on the road where Silas had disappeared, the kind you don't walk away from. That night the cabin felt different. The oppressive dread was gone, replaced by a tense, fragile hope. Abram Hale was a force of nature, a wall of calm authority against the chaos that had descended on them. He sat at the table with James, a bottle of cheap whiskey between them, speaking in the low, clipped tones of men who had seen too much. Ellie, for the first time, joined them. She sat on the edge of the cot, listening, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. Abram didn't push her for details. He was patient, letting the story come out in its own time. "It's the rock," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "The blue rock. That's what they're after." Abram looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Turquoise?" She shook her head. "No, it looks like it, but it's different, heavier. When you get it wet, it leaches something into the water, something that makes you sick. The men who dug it, their hands would swell up. They'd get fevers. Some of them just stopped waking up." James and Abram exchanged a look. This was far worse than a simple, illegal mine. They weren't just enslaving people. They were poisoning them, and they were poisoning the land. "Black Creek," Abram murmured, staring into his whiskey. "The name of the company Silas mentioned, run by a man named Marcus Thorne, a real pillar of the community back east. Rich, powerful, with friends in high places." He sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "I've had rumors about a hidden operation in these hills for months. Strange sicknesses downstream, people disappearing. But I never had anything solid, no proof, no witnesses." He looked at Ellie, his expression grim. "Until now. You're the key, Ellie. Your testimony could bring the whole damn thing down." But his words, meant to be reassuring, had the opposite effect. Ellie shrank back, wrapping her arms around herself. The color drained from her face. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. He'll kill me. He'll kill all of us. Thorne isn't just a businessman. He's a monster." James stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "He won't lay a hand on you." But Ellie was shaking her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You didn't see it. The brand on my back, it's his family crest, the Thorne crest. He told me it was a reminder that I belonged to him, just like the land he stole from my father." The air in the cabin went still. Abram leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "What do you mean he stole it from your father?" "My father, Daniel Rose, was a geologist," she said, the words tumbling out now in a frantic rush. "He discovered this land. He found the vein of that blue rock. He knew it was valuable but also dangerous. He was trying to report it, to get the territory to section it off as a hazard. Then he had an accident out in the hills, a fall." Her voice broke. "A month later, Marcus Thorne showed up with a deed to the land, signed and dated the day before my father died. He said my father sold it to him, but my father would never have sold it. He knew what that rock could do. James felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. This wasn't just about greed anymore. It was about murder, conspiracy. I tried to fight it, Ellie continued, her voice thick with unshed tears. I went to the papers, to the local marshals. No one would listen. They said Thorne was a respectable man. Then one night, his men came for me. They dragged me to the camp. Thorne himself was there. He said since I loved the land so much, I could die on it, just like my father. She looked at James, her eyes pleading. The branding, it wasn't just a punishment. It was a message. He was branding his property. Suddenly, the symbol James had seen etched on her skin flashed in his mind. A hawk with a serpent in its talons. The Thorne family crest. And in that instant, another memory, one he had buried for 12 long years, clawed its way to the surface. A memory from Tennessee. A fancy carriage overturned on a muddy road. A young woman, Lily, lying broken in the dirt. And on the ornate door of the carriage, a painted crest. A hawk with a serpent in its talons. James staggered back, his hand flying to his mouth, a strangled noise escaping his throat. The room tilted, the faces of Abram and Ellie blurring. It couldn't be. A coincidence. A trick of the mind. Abram was on his feet, his hand on James's shoulder. James! What is it? What's wrong? James looked at Abram, his eyes wide with a dawning, soul-crushing horror. His voice was a choked whisper. The man who killed my sister, he worked for Marcus Thorne. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Abram stared at James, his mind struggling to connect the dots across a decade of pain and silence. Ellie looked between the two men, her own tragedy momentarily forgotten in the face of James's raw, naked agony. James, Abram said, his voice gentle but firm. Talk to me. What happened in Tennessee? James sank back into his chair, the strength gone from his legs. He looked at his hands, calloused and worn, but all he could see was the blood. It wasn't a battle, he began, his voice hollow. Not a real one. We were on leave. Me and Lily. She was visiting. She was just 17, full of life. He choked on the memory. We were on the road outside of Nashville. This carriage came barreling down the road, drunk driver, going way too fast. Ran us right off the road. Lily, she was thrown. He closed his eyes, but the image was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. The man who stumbled out of that carriage, he wasn't a soldier. He was rich, arrogant. He saw what he'd done. He saw her lying there, and he just laughed, said she shouldn't have been in his way. The rage, buried for 12 years, came roaring back, hot as a forge. I went for him, but his men, his private guards, they held me back. They just held me there and made me watch while he got back in his carriage and rode away. They left her to die in a ditch like an animal. He looked up, his eyes locking with Abram's. The man driving that carriage, the man who laughed, his name was Silas Thorne. Ellie gasped. Silas? Marcus Thorne's son? He was younger then, James rasped. Barely a man, but it was him. The same smug, cruel face, and the crest on the carriage door, the hawk and the serpent. I never forgot it. The pieces slammed together with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a random convergence of fate. It was a circle of violence, started 12 years ago in Tennessee, now closing in on a dusty cabin in Arizona. The same family, the same evil, had destroyed James's past and now threatened to destroy his future. Abram's face was a grim mask. So, Silas wasn't just here for a runaway worker. He was here to bury a witness. He recognized you, James, or he recognized that you were the kind of man who wouldn't back down. And now that he knows you're tied to me, he didn't have to finish the sentence. They all knew what it meant. Thorne couldn't afford to have a sheriff sniffing around his operation. He couldn't afford to have Ellie Rose telling her story. And he certainly couldn't afford to have James Coulter, a living ghost from his son's past, standing in his way. He wouldn't send 3 men next time. He'd send an army. He'd burn the cabin to the ground and salt the earth, erasing them all from existence. A heavy silence descended on the room. They were no longer just protecting a victim. They were standing against a dynasty of evil, a powerful family that had bought and murdered its way across the country. Ellie was the first to speak, her voice surprisingly steady. The fear was still there, but it was now laced with something else. Steel. My father kept journals, she said, looking at Abram. Detailed notes on the rock, the land surveys, his correspondence with Marcus Thorne. Everything. He hid them before his accident. If I can get to them, it's the proof you need. It's more than my testimony. It's his. Abram leaned forward. Where are they? In the floorboards of our old homestead. It's abandoned now, about 5 miles north of here, right on the edge of the land Thorne controls. James stood up, the old soldier taking over. The grief was still there, a burning coal in his chest, but it was now fuel for a cold, clear purpose. It's a trap. I know, Abram agreed. Thorne's men will be watching it. They'll be watching this place. We're caught between them. No, James said, his eyes scanning the crude map Abram had drawn on the table. Not between. We go through. He pointed a finger at a spot on the map. They'll expect us to fortify this cabin, or they'll expect us to make a run for town. They won't expect us to go on the offensive. A wild, desperate plan began to form in his mind, a plan born of grief and rage. We don't wait for them to bring the war to us, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. We take the war to them. The plan was simple and bordering on suicidal. They would split up. Abram would ride hard for redemption, not for reinforcements. That would take too long, but to send a telegraph to the federal marshals in Prescott. He would use his authority as sheriff to claim federal jurisdiction, hoping the threat of marshals would make Thorne hesitate, buying them precious time. Meanwhile, under the cover of darkness, James and Ellie would make a break for her old homestead. They would retrieve the journals and then disappear into the harsh, labyrinthine canyon lands to the east, terrain James knew like the back of his own hand. They would hide, wait for Abram and the marshals, and live to fight another day. It was a long shot. Every part of it could go wrong. Thorne's men are watching the road, James said, pointing at the map. They'll see you leave, Abram. They'll know something's up. Let them, Abram said, checking the loads in his revolver. It'll draw their attention. They'll think the girl is with me. It'll give you two a better chance of slipping away unnoticed. He stood, his face set. I'll ride out in an hour. You two leave a few minutes after. Use the dry creek bed to get past the ridge. It'll be slow going, but it'll keep you out of sight. He looked at Ellie, his expression softening. You ready for this, kid? She nodded, her jaw tight. I've been running for months. I'm tired of running away from them. It's time I ran towards something. Abram clapped James on the shoulder one last time. Stay alive, old friend. Justice is coming. You too, James grunted. An hour later, they watched from the darkened window as Abram mounted his horse and rode out, not even trying to be quiet. He was the decoy, a lone rider drawing the eyes of the wolves hiding in the hills. As the sound of his hoofbeats faded, James turned to Ellie. He handed her a small water skin and a canvas pack with some dried meat. He'd traded his shotgun for a rifle and had a pistol tucked into his belt. Time to go, he said. Stay close. Don't make a sound. And whatever happens, don't stop moving. She just nodded, her eyes reflecting a mixture of terror and determination. They slipped out the back of the cabin, melting into the shadows like ghosts. The night was moonless, a blanket of impenetrable blackness that was both their cover and their enemy. They moved slowly, carefully, James in the lead, every sense on high alert. The dry creek bed was treacherous in the dark, full of loose rocks and thorny bushes that seemed to grab at their clothes. After what felt like an eternity, they cleared the ridge line that overlooked the cabin. James paused, motioning for Ellie to get down. He crept to the edge and peered back the way they came. His blood ran cold. Torches, a dozen of them, maybe more, snaking their way up the ridge road toward his cabin. Silas and his army had arrived. They had waited for Abram to leave, assuming the cabin was now an easy target. They were a few minutes too late. A grim satisfaction settled in James's chest. Part one of the plan had worked. But as he watched the ring of fire close in on his empty home, a new horrifying thought struck him. This wasn't just an army to capture a girl. This was an extermination squad. They weren't planning to leave witnesses, and if they found the cabin empty, they would know, without a doubt, where their real targets had gone. To the only other place on the map that mattered, Ellie's homestead. They had to move faster. The 5 miles to the Rose homestead were the longest of James's life. Every rustle of leaves was an ambush. Every hoot of an owl was a signal. The weight of the past and the terror of the future pressed down on him with every step. Beside him, Ellie moved with a grim determination, her fear burned away by adrenaline and purpose. They finally saw it through the trees. A small, dilapidated farmhouse, its windows like hollow eyes in the darkness. A faint light flickered in one of the windows. James pulled Ellie behind a thicket of mesquite. "Someone's there," he whispered, his hand on the rifle. "They're waiting for us," she breathed, her voice trembling. "Maybe." James scanned the area, his soldier's instincts kicking in. "Or maybe they're just searching it. If they knew we were coming, they'd be hidden. An ambush." "This is sloppy." He looked at her. "Stay here. I'm going to circle around the back." "No," she said, grabbing his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "I know the layout. There's a loose cellar door around back, covered by the woodpile. It leads right under the main room. I'm going with you." He hesitated for a second, then nodded. She wasn't a liability. She was a survivor. They crept through the undergrowth, circling the house. The woodpile was right where she said it would be. Working together in the suffocating silence, they moved the logs aside, revealing a low, heavy wooden door. James pried it open. It opened onto a patch of blackness that smelled of damp earth and forgotten memories. "The journals are under a loose floorboard, right below the hearth in the main room," she whispered, her breath hot against his ear. "I can feel for it." He nodded. "I'll be right behind you." They slipped into the cellar, pulling the door shut over them. The darkness was absolute. They crawled on their hands and knees across the packed earth floor, guided by the faint sounds of men talking and walking in the room above them. They could hear the clink of a bottle, a low chuckle. 2 men by the sound of it. They were careless, confident. They reached the area beneath the hearth. Ellie ran her hands over the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling above them, her touch light and practiced. After a moment, she stopped. She pushed upwards. A section of the floor above them lifted silently. A sliver of light cut through the darkness, illuminating her face, etched with tension. She reached up into the gap. Her fingers brushed against a leather-bound book. Then another, and another. She pulled them down, 3 thick journals, and tucked them into her canvas pack. They had it. They had the proof. Suddenly, a heavy boot stomped down on the floor right next to the opening, making them both flinch. "Find anything?" a gruff voice called from across the room above. "Nothing," another voice replied. "Just dust and rats. Silas was wrong. They ain't coming here. They're halfway to redemption with the sheriff." "Good," the first voice said. "Let's finish the whiskey and burn this dump to the ground. Leave nothing behind." James and Ellie froze, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Their escape route was about to be cut off. They were trapped beneath a house that was about to become a funeral pyre. James made a split-second decision. He couldn't fight them both from down here, but he could create a diversion. He pointed to the far corner of the cellar, then back at the opening. Ellie understood immediately. While she scrambled back towards the cellar door, James found what he was looking for, a pile of old, dry timbers stacked against the foundation. He pulled out his pistol, thumbing back the hammer. He wasn't aiming at the men. He was aiming at the lantern sitting on the table directly above him. He took a deep breath, waited for the sound of boots to move away from the spot above him, and fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet tore through the floorboards, shattering the lantern above. Glass exploded. Kerosene splashed across the dry wooden floor. A whoosh of flame erupted, instantly engulfing the room in a hungry, roaring fire. Shouts of panic and surprise came from above. James didn't wait. He scrambled back through the cellar as smoke began to pour through the hole he'd made. He reached the cellar door just as Ellie pushed it open. They spilled out into the night air, gasping for breath, the roar of the fire behind them. They didn't look back. They plunged into the darkness of the woods, the orange glow of the burning homestead lighting their way. They could hear the panicked shouts of Thorne's men as the fire consumed the house, and with it, their only easy way of tracking their prey. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs screamed in protest. They ran towards the canyons, towards the one place James knew they could disappear. But as they put distance between themselves and the fire, a new sound reached them, a chilling sound that turned their blood to ice. The baying of hounds. They hadn't just brought men. They'd brought dogs. The fire had bought them time, but it had also given their pursuers a clear starting point. The chase was on. "This way!" James yelled, his voice ragged. He grabbed Ellie's hand, pulling her along. "The canyons! The water will mask our scent." They crashed through the underbrush, the howling of the dogs growing closer, more frantic. It was a race against time, exhaustion, and the primal terror of being hunted. The entrance to the canyon was a narrow, jagged scar in the earth, a place of sharp rocks and deep shadows. They scrambled down the steep embankment, sliding on loose scree, their hands scraped raw. At the bottom was a shallow, fast-moving creek. "In the water!" James ordered. "Move upstream!" The icy water shocked their systems, but it was their only hope. They stumbled through the creek, the stones slick and treacherous underfoot. The sounds of the dogs were directly above them now, at the canyon's rim, whining and barking in frustration as they lost the scent. They had done it. They had broken the trail. For a moment, they leaned against the cold canyon wall, gasping for air, the sound of the creek and their own ragged breathing filling the silence. They were alive. They were free. But then a new light appeared at the mouth of the canyon, a lantern, and another, and another. Silas Thorne, flanked by half a dozen of his men, stood silhouetted against the night sky, blocking their only way out. He must have anticipated their move, sending a second group to cut them off. He raised a lantern high, its light glinting off the barrel of the rifle in his other hand. "Nowhere left to run, old man," Silas's voice echoed off the canyon walls, dripping with a smug triumph. "And this time, there's no sheriff to save you." They were trapped. The sheer rock walls of the canyon offered no escape. Behind them, the hunt was still ongoing. In front of them stood Silas Thorne and a firing squad. James pushed Ellie behind him, raising his own rifle. His mind raced. There was no way out. He had 6 shots in his rifle, 6 in his pistol. There were at least 7 men in front of them. The math was simple and brutal. "Give me the girl, Coulter," Silas called out, taking a step forward. "And the journals. Do that, and I'll make your death quick. A courtesy I didn't extend to your sister." The words hit James like a physical blow, but he didn't flinch. The rage in his chest burned away the fear, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. He was going to die here. He knew that, but he wasn't going to die alone, and he wasn't going to die without taking Silas Thorne with him. "You'll get nothing from me," James yelled back, his voice echoing in the narrow canyon. "Wrong answer," Silas sneered, raising his rifle to his shoulder. But before he could fire, Ellie stepped out from behind James. Her face was pale in the lantern light, but her eyes were blazing with a fire that matched his own. "You want the journals, Thorne?" she screamed, her voice shaking but full of defiance. She held up the canvas pack. "Here they are, come and get them." And with a powerful heave, she threw the pack not at Silas, but into the deepest, fastest-moving part of the creek. The canvas bag hit the water with a splash and was instantly caught by the current, whisked away into the darkness downstream. Silas stared, his mouth agape in disbelief, then his face contorted into a mask of pure fury. "You stupid girl! You've just signed your own death warrant." He aimed his rifle, no longer at James, but straight at Ellie's heart. James reacted without thinking. He shoved Ellie aside, raised his own rifle, and fired. The world exploded in a cacophony of sound and light. His shot went wide as one of Silas's men fired at the same time, the bullet grazing James's shoulder, spinning him around. More gunshots erupted from both sides, the canyon turning into a deafening echo chamber of death. James scrambled behind a large boulder, pulling Ellie with him. He risked a glance over the top. 2 of Thorne's men were down, but his own rifle was empty. He pulled out his pistol. 4 shots left. He knew it was over. There were too many of them. They were pinned down, outgunned, and out of time. Silas was shouting orders, his men advancing from rock to rock, closing in for the kill. Then from high above them, on the rim of the canyon, a new sound cut through the chaos. A single, clear, piercing whistle. Everyone froze, looking up. A figure stood on the canyon rim, silhouetted against the first hint of dawn. It was Sheriff Abram Hale, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were at least a dozen other figures, all holding rifles. A posse. Silas Thorne! Abram's voice boomed down into the canyon, a voice of absolute authority. In the name of the law of the United States Territory of Arizona, I order you to drop your weapons and surrender. Silas stared up in disbelief. You're alone, Sheriff. Your bluff won't work. Abram laughed, a hard, humorless sound. Am I? He called back. These aren't my deputies, son. These are the men from downriver, the ranchers and farmers whose wells you've been poisoning, whose livestock have been dying. They were very interested to hear what Miss Rose had to say after she sent her little package downstream. Downstream, the journals. James looked at Ellie, a slow, dawning realization on his face. She hadn't thrown the journals away in defiance. It was a calculated move, a message in a bottle. She had known about the downstream ranches. She had been counting on the current to deliver her father's legacy into the right hands. She had saved them all. Silas followed Abram's gaze down the canyon, and there, emerging from the pre-dawn gloom, was another group of armed men, blocking the canyon's exit. They were trapped. For a moment, Silas Thorne, the arrogant son of a powerful man, looked like a cornered rat. His men looked at him, then at the rifles aimed down at them, and began to slowly, one by one, drop their guns. The fight was over, but Silas wasn't going to be taken alive. With a primal scream of rage and hatred, he turned his rifle not on the posse above, but on the one person who had caused his downfall. He aimed it straight at James. "This is for Tennessee!" he screamed. Two shots rang out at almost the exact same time. One from Silas's rifle, one from Abram's. Silas's shot hit James square in the chest, knocking him off his feet. Abram's shot hit Silas square in the forehead. He dropped like a stone, his reign of terror finally over. James lay on the cold, wet stones of the creek bed, the world going gray at the edges. He could hear Ellie screaming his name, her voice sounding distant, like it was coming through a long tunnel. He felt a strange sense of peace. He had kept his promise. He hadn't failed this time. He had protected her. He had seen it through to the end. His debt was paid. He closed his eyes, the face of his sister Lily filling his vision, and for the first time in 12 years, she was smiling. The darkness took him, but he didn't die. He woke up days later in a real bed, in a clean room in the sheriff's office, the sun streaming through a barred window. His chest was tightly bandaged, and a searing pain shot through him with every breath. Ellie was asleep in a chair by his bed, her hand resting on his arm. Abram was standing at the foot of the bed, a rare smile on his face. "Welcome back to the land of the living," Abram said quietly. "The bullet missed your heart by an inch. Doctor says you're too stubborn to die." James tried to speak, but only a dry croak came out. "Easy now," Abram said, handing him a cup of water. "It's over, James. It's all over. With Silas dead and the journals as evidence, Marcus Thorne's entire empire is crumbling. The federal marshals are arresting his associates all over the country. The men from the camp have been freed, and they're all willing to testify." He looked over at Ellie, his voice softening. "And this young lady is being hailed as a hero, used her father's inheritance, the land that is now rightfully hers again, to set up a fund for the workers Thorne victimized. She's giving them a new start." James looked at Ellie's sleeping face. She looked different. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. The haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by peace. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a leader, a force for good, born from the ashes of her own personal hell. He had thought he was saving her, but in the end, they had saved each other. She gave him a reason to fight again, and he gave her the space to find her own strength. The West was still a wild, dangerous place. There would always be monsters like Marcus Thorne and his son. But now James knew there would also always be people like Ellie Rose to stand against them, and people like him and Abram to stand with them. His solitary life was over. He had stepped back into the world, not as a ghost haunted by the past, but as a man with a future. He had a new purpose, a new family. Here's the thing about a story like this. It makes you ask yourself a question. When you see someone stumble out of the darkness, broken and afraid, what do you do? Do you close the door, hoping the trouble passes you by? Or do you open it wide, knowing that it might just save you both? The world is full of dark corners and hidden camps. It's full of people who have been beaten down and told they don't matter. But every now and then, one of them escapes. And what happens next depends entirely on who they run into. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in second chances and fighting for what's right, do me a favor and hit that like button. And let me know in the comments, what part of this story hit you the hardest? And if you want to hear more stories about the darkness that lurks just off the beaten path and the unlikely heroes who decide to fight back, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because out here, the stories never really end. They just wait for someone brave enough to tell them.